Well, we're going to give this another shot. Hopefully, this is going to work just fine for us right now. Thank you for joining us today. Hope you're having a fabulous day. Terry should be jumping on with here in just a second as we're trying to both fix a couple things and improve the patient process here a little bit. Our focus right now for today is talking about the. I think it's on Terry's edge. I was fine beforehand. Terry, you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
I think there you go. I think whatever it was, now we're good. Can you hear me?
Hopefully it's fixed now.
Good. Do you hear me? I hear you.
I hear you. Let's start all over then.
Awesome. I think we're 100%. I hear no echo, so whatever was going on is solved. So thanks for everyone for joining us today as we're going to break down some aspects of the work of evangelists. Our goals are very simplified. When Terry and I started this project, we did not expect this particular outcome. In that, both elders and evangelists and men, as a group all together, began to reach out to us and ask very simple questions like, do you know anybody who is looking on both ends of the equation? And with that, Terry and I put together a list of some of the benefits of the experiences that we've shared in our recent transition process with a real basic goal, trying to give some insight to make the process better. And so we're going to try to break down some very simple stuff like questions you should ask, important aspects about the decision that you may not think about before you go. And so, Harry, let's go ahead and start right back at the beginning.
Okay.
And one of the first topics we've got for us is looking beyond the moment. And this is what I meant by that. Very often, you're making your decision process on the basis of what just happened, whether it's a congregation that said, hey, our beloved evangelist retired and moved to North Alabama to be near his family, or we needed to make a change and the change was unpleasant. And so we don't want what we had. We want something different than that. Or the preacher side, the same thing. It didn't go very well. And so what I need to find is a congregation that's not like the one that I was at. And if it's not like that, then clearly it's going to be better. The moment that you're in cannot define good decisions about tomorrow. It just doesn't work that way. And so firstly, know what you need. Know the environment that you need, not what you want, in order to be effective in the work of the kingdom.
Yeah, and as I was explaining earlier, a lot of churches don't understand that. They have wants, but not needs. So again, let me just quickly summate, since we had such issues before. Some churches want a guy that's mine and Phil's age with kids at home. They may need a guy that's older than Phil and I that have more wisdom to help them through a particular issue they're facing. They need to know the difference between a need and a want. Young guys especially seem to want, and I think Phil would agree with this, these two preacher arrangements for whatever reason it is. And I'm a believer. I know that my greatest growth came probably in my first work when I was the only guy. I was young, but I was forced to learn a lot of lessons. And I was mentored along the way from older guys long distance. But sometimes a young guy needs to go to a place where he's the only guy and he carries the load, and that's what he needs. It's not what he wants. It's what he needs. And you could debate a lot of that, but there's a difference between need and want in all of this.
Right.
And I said earlier about the moment, the other problem with that is what you were saying. The other issue is the desperation factor in the moment, which is we don't have a preacher or I don't have a paycheck. And so you sometimes look at that moment with the desperation that is, quite frankly, not healthy.
Right, and there's solutions in the process of that to alleviate the desperation side. Great relationships of congregations in transition could be part of it. Doing a little tent work on the side kind of gives you some flexibility to extend those bumper zones. And I'll add this, I think a lot of folks are looking for this guy named Chris Cantrell because they take the two most popular individuals and they just kind of slash them together and say, we want that guy because that guy here would be awesome. And what they don't know is that guy doesn't actually exist. Even the guys whose names I've applied, like Apollos and Paul, to our issue here, they don't actually exist. They're archetypes. They're not real things because you don't know them. You don't know the reason
Yeah.
why the success takes place in the context where they are.
Yeah, and a lot of those things are based solely off of reputation, but not firsthand experience. And you may find out that Chris Cantrell's not what you thought he was to begin with.
Right.
uh, in that whole aspect. And I tell you the key to this too is not just knowing, and we talked about this, not just knowing what you need, but who you are. I am not Chris Cantrell, and
Yeah.
neither is Phil. And
We're going to use that forever
Phil,
now.
yeah. Phil is not Terry Francis, and Terry Francis is not Phil Martin, and we are very different. And one of the things that Phil and I talked a lot when we were going through the transition of where to move, we talked about places and about where we were good fits. And I ended up at a place, quite frankly, that is probably one of the best fits for me personally. Phil may not have been a good fit for this church,
Yeah, and
more
I
than
talked
likely.
to the shepherds there in the process, and in that conversation, that we had one long conversation with one of the elders there. I'm like, yeah, I didn't feel like they were ready.
Yeah.
There had been some very significant reasons for their need to shift, and I could see some opportunities there, evangelistically, spiritually, but it wouldn't have been a good fit at that time. And then some time
Yeah.
goes by, and boom. And timing has a lot to do with this. Hal talks about we don't get to choose between needs and our wants. Timing is a powerful thing. There are groups that have brethren that Terry and I both know that we both love, that when we were looking to shift our location, they weren't. And either of us may have been great fits for them a year later, 2 years later. And so there's a timing factor that balances in needs, wants, opportunities, who you are, all of those factors together that really are important to understand beyond the moment.
Well, and
Self-aware and self-concern there plays into it too.
and along those lines, Phil, I mean, you and I have talked about this. We both had opportunities to move, and the timing wasn't right for us. I mean, I had a place that I would have loved to have been at that talked to me a year and a half before I did move, and my son was a junior in high school, and I wasn't going to do that to my son. And that would have been a tremendous opportunity for me, but the timing was bad on my end for
Yeah.
that, and I said no. So you have to realize that. Let me make a plea to church leadership right now, if any of them are listening. In these times of transition, the greatest thing for the kingdom is for you to take your time, but also to allow the guy who is leaving you the proper time to find the right fit. And there seems to be this magic number of 3 months normally that's thrown out there. That may be too short in a lot of cases. I know I had 6 months, and I think Phil had a little bit more open-ended even than that. And I was told if I needed more time, that would be possible. If you want to glorify God, make sure that you allow that opportunity, unless it's just some caustic, toxic relationship that can't be done that way.
Right.
Um,
When
uh,
I moved from my first long gospel meeting / work, I said, I think I might need 3 months. And they said, great, you have 6 weeks.
yeah,
And then when I moved again later, 5 years later, it was no time crunch on it. Um, you know, that it's like you find the right fit for your family. And we're going to
yeah,
do the same. And so I'll tell you, in the healthy transition sense, leaving Wilsonville, Oregon to move to Tennessee was as healthy as it could be for both parties. This last Sunday I preached there, the next Sunday, the guy that followed me preached his first full-time sermon. And so I think that's a really healthy transition. It allowed there to be a great connector. And I would encourage places to try to have that as the goal. If everything is moved forward that way, it's going to be better for all the parties. You're going to have the time you need to make some good research. Let me add a couple things on this moment side. Do not allow the pressure of fear to permit you to not do your due diligence in the process. And that kind of leads us to this next question of looking under the surface of things. Ask really good questions. Terry and I joke about asking questions of different types in some ways, but some of them are really important. Questions about how, questions about why. I'll tell you that for me, I can figure out the doctrinal stance stuff in about 5 minutes. Yes, no questions usually figure most of that stuff out. But what I really want to know is approach to leadership methodology, is the how and the why you arrive at a conclusion. That's more important to me than the conclusion, because when the issues shift as they do culturally, generation to generation and day to day, I need to know why. Like, why did you make this decision? Because a new one's going to come up, and we've got to be back on the same page, on the same perspective, because leadership works together as a formative unit. Eldership, deacons, evangelists, I will tell you that you are more of a team than islands trying to work together. And so really, it's really important to develop an understanding of that how. Even once you figure out that this is the right place for you, take some time to work through that too. I think those are really, really important. Terry dropped some of his questions up as important starting points. I'll say that for me, and I haven't even looked at his list in detail yet, whatever that list is, it's not exhaustive. It's illustrative of ideas. One thing that works for me well is I want them to get them talking about themselves. Tell me about themselves, both the group as a whole, the congregation, but also the shepherds, the leaders there. I'll say for me, for the most part, I only was really in conversation with groups that already had an eldership in place. And so I kind of, in the past, it hasn't been that way. And I didn't exclusively do that either, to be fair. So I think those are under the surface, under the hood things you've got to do. Let me add one more thing, and we're going to kind of punt a topic to the future. We'll talk about the preacher and his finances at a later time. We haven't specified the date for it yet, but we will talk about that.
Let me say this about all that too, is I think the under the surface, I compared in our first video that had audio issues, that this process to me is a lot like dating. When you are young and looking for a wife, you put your best foot forward. You don't expose all your flaws. And when a church is looking for a preacher, they put their best foot forward. And when a preacher's looking for a church, he puts his best foot forward. I mean, when you try out somewhere, and we'll talk about tryout in a minute, you preach your best sermon. You don't go and say, what's my worst sermon, so they know it's all uphill from here. Like, that's not what you do. And so from that standpoint, you go into this knowing that, but you need to ask questions and get kind of deep to have at least an understanding of where they're at and try to find out where all that's at. You're trying to form essentially a lifetime relationship potentially with somebody in generally less than 6 weeks is how long that takes probably.
Right. And let me drop
Think
this.
about that. If your kid came home and they've been dating a girl for 6 weeks and they're getting married, you would be concerned. So you need to ask lots of questions.
Yeah. Do not approach it from either side with the mindset that says this is Cinderella and Prince Charming. It's just simply not. If you think you're the princess of the ball, preacher or congregation, you've kind of lost sight of reality. Because every group of Christians that I've ever met or worked with believes that they are faithful, evangelistic, and the best place to be. Every preacher I know is putting forth his best sermons. He wouldn't be doing the work if he didn't feel like his work was necessary. And so on the more realistic term, you're not actually looking for the king and the queen. You're looking for a relationship that allows growth. And that's going to have to push you away from this concept. Terry's got it as the Bachelor, as a thought concept. You're not looking for a prize pony.
Well, and that goes further, because I think the way we do this gets also into the method of talking to people. I despise the Bachelor and the Bachelorette. It's big news in Alabama because the Bachelorette's from Alabama, and my 15-year-old daughter apparently really likes this now. So we had to talk about this yesterday. But not only are you not going to find Mr. Perfect and Miss Right in this kind of short fantasized time like they do on The Bachelor, the other thing I would add to that is often the way we approach this is just like The Bachelor. And what I mean by that is, as a preacher, it's really tempting to go try out at every church that will talk to you in 6 weeks, 7 weeks, 8 weeks, and then you vote them off one at a time and decide who you're going to hand the last rose to.
Yeah.
And churches have the same mentality where they're going to bring in 18 guys, and I could tell you, in my first work, I know that's what happened. They brought in like 6 people. I saw the written record where they voted people off one at a time, and it came down to me and a man I respected. I was 23 and he was 75, and I won the job by a vote of 8-7. And that is not how that should be done, by the way.
Yeah.
And so
tag this.
avoid that mentality.
Yeah. A congregation I know of that exists in Florida, I went and talked to them about the work and kind of determined it wasn't the right fit from my side. The vote there, they did a vote, was 8-7 for me to not come. Probably like 6 months later, a couple new members moved into the congregation, and a good friend of ours, someone that Terry and I both know, went and tried out. They had a vote, and the vote was 9-8 in his favor. And he was there for a short while and encountered some difficulties. I don't know if there's a tie-in between those details, but there certainly is a thread of process that's not producing the right results. Because if that's your process, you're always going to end up with strain, stress, and difficulty, no matter who the guy is. You may find the very best man. If you put him in the wrong spot, he's a great guy, good speaker, great evangelist. He's this Chris Cantrell we're looking for. He won't be effective because it's not the right place for him. You're going to hear that phrase.
Well, the problem with Chris Cantrell, quite frankly, is I hear that he cannot excel that much more. So anyway.
Well, it may be because he spends too much time in coffee shops. I'm not quite sure.
So let me add to that. So we talked about this Bachelor. Let's talk about the tryout process. And let me say that I think this is an area, in looking under the surface, that our culture has changed tremendously. When Phil and I started preaching about 20 plus years ago, the internet was a new thing, but it was not really a thing among churches. We still recorded sermons on cassette tapes. Phil and I are that generation that's transitioned into that. We've had those meetings. I'm sure Phil did. I know I did, where we had hundreds of cassette tapes, and the question was, what are we going to do with these? And my answer was, throw them away, because nobody has a cassette player anymore, which is sad, but I digress. We live in a time where if somebody wants to hear me preach or Phil preach, we both have hundreds of sermons online, and you can hear us. And you talk about looking below the surface to churches. Let me say this. The surface of our job is our preaching. The stuff that goes on Monday through Saturday and outside of the pulpit, that's the stuff that you need to talk about more. And you don't learn that from hearing me and Phil preach. So what used to happen, because there's no way to really do this unless you sent cassettes, is the way this all used to go down is they would bring you in for a tryout for a weekend, and they would interview you while you were there. And since you're there, they'd let you preach, and they introduce you to the church. And I'm just going to tell you that is an archaic method of finding a preacher. That what you can do today is you can do all of those things without ever having to come into the congregation and meet them. And how that works is simply this, and I've been through this process recently, and I've helped the church in this process. You can listen to a guy's sermons, multiple sermons online. You could probably find video for a lot of guys online at this point. So you can watch them preach. You can Skype interview those guys, not even a phone interview. You can watch their mannerisms. You can see how they act. You can see how they answer questions. You can do that multiple times. I know of churches that have done that. They have flown the individual in to meet with the elders and meet their family, and they have not put them up in the pulpit. And I will tell you, I think there's a lot of wisdom from that.
Yeah.
And what's happened is the traditional tryout that was the beginning of the process years ago, that is actually, and I think should be, the very last thing that happens. Elders Don't introduce a preacher to your congregation that you don't already think is the right fit. Do all your homework first and be determined. And it doesn't mean he's the guy, but it does mean, hey, we're 98% sure that unless this is just some toxic representation on a Sunday, that this is the guy. And you present him to the church that way, and you do one guy at a time. Now, I know of a church right now that's going through this, and they're doing a lot of interviews and interviewing a lot of guys, but they're only going to bring one guy in. Mm-hmm. And the same goes for preachers. When I was going through this, and I told Phil this when I started, I talked to a lot of places. I went in person and talked to a couple of places, but I was only going to try out one time.
Yeah.
I was only going to introduce my family to one church if that was at all possible.
Right. And let me be fair. You can plan that, and it may not actually work that way.
Work that way.
There's some timing issues there. There's some personality fits. There's a lot of this stuff that you cannot control. Just accept that. Accept that you will not be in control of every corner of this, but you can plan in a way to make it be more successful than stressful. In regards to a couple of things that are connected to this, in that background conversation you have, especially I'm talking to those who shepherd their flocks, those who are elders, those who are maybe members in that congregation, make it be in a place that's not typical for what you would think. And this is what I mean by that. Take them out to dinner in a smaller setting. Go play golf if you like golf. I'm looking at you, Andy Bethay. But if you like to be outdoors, go outdoors. Spend time with them in a context that's not the square box of their office or where the elders regularly meet, so that you can then see how they interact with people around all of those edges. Like, I want to see how an elder interacts with his wife. I want to see how this evangelist interacts with a customer service person at a restaurant or something. I will tell you that I think those will probably tell you more about the fit side of things than the guy who comes in, pulls out his very best sermon, stands up there, presents it to the perfect T from beginning to end on his fit with you and the fit with the congregation. I just encourage you.
And to that point, to elders, let me say this. If you're not hiring a guy who's looking, but you're trying to pull a guy away, which we all know happens, mm-hmm. rather than bringing him in for a tryout so quickly, maybe before you even talk to him, you should drive to where he's at, a couple of you, and see him in the environment where he's at. Is the church, when you walk in, are they welcoming? Do they look like they're a growing church? Do they look like they're stagnant? How's his sermon? You can go in unannounced even before you even talk to him. Hey, we've heard of this guy, Phil Martin. He's down in Georgia. Let's just pop in and see what it's looked like before we ever mention this to him.
Right.
Those are all possibilities of you doing your homework to make sure that you find the right fit without this parade of bringing a guy in that you don't even know if he's a possible fit yet. And then you've exposed him. And here's the thing you learn about this. Elders, there's this idea, because we approach this corporately, that you got to have 4 interviewees before you really make a decision. What you've done is you've created a division within the congregation already, because inevitably somebody is going to like every person you bring in. And you bring in 4 people, that church may not be divided into perfect force, but you hire one guy, chances are at least 30% of the congregation already don't like him because their guy didn't get hired. Yeah. So you've created a problem from the very beginning if you're not careful.
Right. And again, you may do everything perfectly. Those who are on the hiring side of things and bring in a guy and he says no. Robert just mentioned he also damaged 3 guys' confidences. That's absolutely true. Like, don't bring them in to make them feel better. It doesn't work that way. If you just bring them in just to make them feel better, like, oh, you got to try out, you actually made them feel worse.
And I know of a church that did that. They brought somebody in to let them try out because a member wanted them to come get a chance.
Yeah.
And there was never a chance. There was never a chance for that guy to get that job.
Yeah.
And that's not fair to him.
Frankly, it's dishonest. Just straight up. It's not honest. If you want the guy to come preach for you for a Sunday because you want to encourage him, be honest. We're not looking for you to come here and work with us, but we do want to give you an opportunity to interact with the flock here and help us grow on this particular Sunday, and be straight up about it, be honest about it. And then there's no hurt feelings. And if the guy doesn't want to come, okay, he doesn't want to come. If he does, great. Let me connect some dots for us. We've got our last segment of ideas, which is looking over the mountain. And that's where we tie in concepts of a genuine vision for what tomorrow looks like, an honest appreciation for how you integrate into the group as that change takes place, and what that practical working relationship will look like. One of Terry's questions he asked at the end of it was, how will you respond when someone, or if someone doesn't like my sermon? I'll tell you more specifically, when someone doesn't like the sermon you preached. But seeing what that future looks like is kind of hard, but not too difficult, because all that it is an extension of the past trajectory. So you can look at the past, see a bit of the present, and say, where are we going? How do I fit into this? If you're bringing in a guy, and let's say it's in a two-preacher arrangement, and that guy is expected to be involved heavily into evangelism outside the building, then you better be ready to support that guy. Elders, or if you're shifting that way from a preacher, you better be ready to give up the pulpit and say, well, my role here is not to be in the pulpit every Sunday, it's to be in the Bible classes, it's to be in the home studies. You guys better figure out a way ahead of time, 1 year, 2 year, 5 years down the road, where everyone's still working well together toward that goal. And preachers have ego. And unless we get those egos in check, we can create problems in that process too. So Terry, what are some of the questions you've asked folks in regards to vision that you felt were important?
Well, so, I mean, some of them are on there when I asked about what is your vision for the next 5 years, for the next 10 years? Does your vision include multiple workers? How are we going to work together long term? Those are pretty generic questions, but I tell you what I found out in asking those questions is you learn pretty quickly whether they've even considered that.
Yeah.
It's not uncommon, by the way, for a group of elders to sit there and go, hey, where do you want to see this church in 10 years? What's your vision for it? For them to go, well, we've never really thought about that. Now, you have a choice there based on other answers. You could be the guy that helps them develop that. Or you might realize in your discussion with them, they never intend to have a vision for 10 years down the road.
Right.
It's really hard to drag an eldership along to a place they don't want to go. And so sometimes it's not even the answer, but the way the attitude of their answer that will reveal a lot to you when you ask those kind of questions.
Yeah. And when you're looking over the mountains, I want to add one comment that I think is really important. Finding the right place and finding the right person is also a function of being the right person and being the right place. I'm going to say some hard things for both sides of the equation here in a second. If the congregation you're at seems to struggle to either retain a preacher or find a preacher that wants to work with them, the preacher's not going to fix that. Straight up, the problem is the environment is not conducive to maintaining that relationship. And when I say environment, I mean the people. The same thing is true on the preacher's edge. If the preacher, not because he gets the itch to move and wants change, and some guys are like that, but if a preacher can't stay more than 2 or 3 years somewhere before a problem comes up, then I'm going to tell you straight up that the problem is the preacher. He may be an honest, hardworking, moral guy. He hasn't learned how to combine the integrated aspect of humility, drive, and competency to be effective. And you got to package those things there to work as a team in that context. If you can't do that, problem's more on you, elder, preacher, congregant, than the other parties, especially if a pattern develops where every 2 years, new guy comes. Here we go again.
Well, and I will tell you that I'm one of those guys, and I think feels like this. I don't want to move every 5 years.
Yeah.
I mean, I know there's some guys that doesn't bother them. There was a time that every church thought that's what you need to do is change preachers every 5 years. So if I interview at a place and I know that part of their vision is every 5 years they change preachers, and maybe they don't say that, but I can look back and see that part of their vision is they change preachers every 5 years, I'm not going there.
Yeah.
It just doesn't match my vision. So your vision and their vision have to cooperate long term. That has to work.
They don't have to be the same.
Right.
They have to be able to be harmonious together. As a group in the Southeast that I know, I'm not trying to be vague on purpose, that for years and even till now, they have a 2-year rotation. A preacher's going to be there for 2 years. And then he's going to be needing to look to be somewhere else. And they had that when 2 generations ago. Like, I know these families, I know these people who went through those cycles. I think those are powerful aspects of getting the vision on the same page and being the right person and the right place. If you begin to work on that, the place where you're at can actually turn into the relationship of Cinderella and Prince Charming, because everyone's began to change healthily.
And likewise, I know of a place, just another example with a different kind of application, that they kind of have this hard, fast rule that when they grow to 200 people, they start another work nearby.
Yeah.
That's something that I'm just personally kind of opposed to at this point. So I'm not going to go there knowing that that's the plan, because I don't like seeing churches divide just because they don't have the facilities.
Right.
So you have to know and see if you can work in that environment and cooperate and be able to get along. Because if you can't, and that goes so much back to looking in the moment. Sometimes you're so in the moment about needing a job or needing a preacher that you don't look beyond the mountain to make sure that this is a good fit. Just to kind of tie that all back up, you got to be really careful about that.
And it requires a level of individual and group honesty to reach to that destination. Like, you've got to be honest on the internal side with yourself and say, look, this is what I'm good at. This is what I'm not that good at. And if you have a vision of someone being good at everything, that guy doesn't actually exist. He's developed skill to cover up for his weaknesses, but he's still not good at everything. And looking over the mountain in that working relationship, something else you have to look at is, well, let's say the elders of the group you're moving to are in their 60s. Odds are that you would hope that new elders will come online and begin to serve, and that relationship will fundamentally change. It's very true that adding one person to an eldership essentially creates a new eldership. And taking away one person from an eldership essentially creates a new eldership. So that means that working relationship is going to shift. And that shift is going to create different waves of need and opportunity. And like Terry, we tend to be mindset towards stay in one location and do good work. Grow the group as well as we can. And at least if you're going to use metrics, then neither of us really like metrics. The places we've been have grown, at various rates as God gave increase. So that means you're going to encounter a lot of these things will shift over time. New families means new mindsets. You may have the group that you're with grow so much with so many new families, but their vision of the congregation's future no longer matches yours. You may move to work with one group and that group doesn't exist anymore because God has given increase to your labors, and now the timing's changed and it's time for you to find a new field. That's a hard thing to swallow too in that process as well.
And I know we're really out of time, but let me say this. We didn't have this in the notes, but something maybe to say is, I know there's some people that aren't preachers and you're not elders, so you're not in these two categories we spent the most time talking to. But to just the typical member, you play an important role in this whole process. You need to pray about it, pray for your leaders to make the right decision. If you're friends with these preachers that are leaving you, as much as you may not want to see them leave, pray that they end up in the right place. But the other thing you need to do is you need to make this transition when that decision to hire somebody is there as peaceful of a process as possible. I know of elders who've done what I think would be the right thing in how they've handled their interview process, and they have brought people in and said, hey, we've talked to a lot of people, but this is the guy we think best fits us. And there have been members who are upset about that because they didn't feel like they were in the process as much as they should be. But what they don't realize is that the elders have spent hours, and I mean literally hours, of interviewing and talking with this guy and praying about this guy and other guys and coming to the conclusion that this is the best fit of what and I hate to say it this way, but of who is available or willing to come.
Yeah.
And as a member, sometimes you do need to submit to your leaders and trust them in that and make that peaceful. Sometimes what's happened, and I know this happened a couple of times, where then, it's basically the elders, the preacher are all determined they're going to go together and start this work together. And the the members revolt so much against that idea because of the process, maybe not even the preacher, but that whole thing falls apart, and it's crushing on a lot of different ways, and it's damaging. So as members, your peaceful kind of submission to this process and trust in your leadership is extremely important in this transition.
Right. And if you think no one knows you're upset when you're upset about this stuff, because you can kind of cover it, well, those shepherds know their flock. They know you're bothered. And even if you say, no, it's okay. Most of these things that we see like that are actually choices. You choose to be upset, and you choose to be agitated, and you choose to continue to respond with agitation and an upsetness in that regard. And so learning to be harmonious in that process is actually a powerful good for all parties involved. The preacher who left, preachers who's coming, but the flock as a whole. The flock is you, and the flock is us. And so we really need that level of stability. Let me throw out a couple things before we get to the hard close time frame. One thing, if you're preaching, I'm just going to Terry and I are basically leaning into this concept at this point. If you're looking to move somewhere and you want someone to talk to about it, talk to us. We may not know of anywhere that's looking. Like I do not maintain a list. I have no desire to maintain a list. I'm not going to start maintaining a list, although people do sometimes say, hey, if you know. But give us a call. We'll talk. If you're a congregation that's looking, with or without elders, and you want some insight from the inside, give us a call. Myself or Terry would be happy to talk to you. We can come together if the context works out just right. I think that would be a helpful congregation on the inside edge of things to bring some insight there. Anything that we do beyond that is designed to glorify the kingdom. We joke a little bit about, hey, do we get like a finder's fee or a retainer's fee? I'm like, I'm just looking for tacos, man. They just, taco here and there. But no, really, we love God's people, and we want the kingdom to grow, and we want people to be in the right places so that the work can go well. And so it's more about that than anything else. So go ahead and reach out to us directly. It kind of ties into our need to, if you got stuff we want to talk about, let us know. We'll talk about it. This process is uncomfortable for everybody, of that finding process. One more thing we did not mention that I think is really important. If you're looking on either side of the equation, most folks live in a regional context. So I would only know places maybe right now that I've either lived before or where I'm presently living that might be looking. Same thing for Terry. So ask more people. There's no harm in talking to somebody about, hey, do you know anyone? So be more open about that. You'll find open doors that you didn't know even existed. Terry?
Absolutely. Yeah, I just we want to help, and please understand our purpose here is to glorify God. And as Phil said, we get phone calls. I get phone calls from guys that I know that go, hey, I'm looking. Do you know of anybody? That's a common thing. We don't keep a running list. Not going to do that, but we do have knowledge of places, and we'll do what we can to help you. We started this page largely to help preachers grow in their work and to help churches understand the work of preachers maybe better than they did. And this process is painful for both sides. And if we can help in some way to alleviate that pain and make that easier, that's our goal with a discussion like today, especially, is to help both sides understand that better.
Yeah. And to again, look at it in a way that the goal is success spiritually, holistically, on the family level, on the emotional side, so that the gospel has the greatest impact to the greatest reaches. And if you can try to kind of keep that in your mind, you may find out that the place you need to try out at is the place that you're presently at. And I want to suggest that to a lot of guys, is that maybe the thing you need to do is go to that eldership and go to that congregation and say, let's renew our relationship together. Let's
Yeah.
go through the process of talking about this on a really direct level. As a little side note for you, like, retry out. Am I still the right fit here? Maybe we'll
Well,
find
and
out that I am.
along those lines, I'll say that sometimes a preacher is going through something and he thinks the key to overcoming that is to leave. And it may be that you're the only one that can stay. So be careful about just jumping at leaving,
Yeah,
and to elders, be careful about just firing a guy.
yeah,
Sometimes that's happened and that was not a good thing.
right.
So do that very cautiously.
Yeah. All right, everybody. Like we mentioned before, we've got some topics on the table already that'll be coming up. We will be talking about the preacher and his finances, not from a money management side, but really laying down some concepts in regards to what things actually cost, and how we might re-understand the financial relationship between an evangelist and congregational work. Beyond that, we've got some other topics on the table that we're still trying to schedule. And so we're working out some solutions there. And if you've got questions, we may not have answers, but we're willing to consider them for a while and tell you, I don't know, or
Yeah.
go talk to this person. Have a great day, and may God bless your work.